first reading is from the first chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. I, the teacher, when king over Israel is Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I say all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and chasing after wind. I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to those who come after me. And who knows whether they will be wise or foolish? Yet they will be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned and gave my heart up to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What do mortals get from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain, and their work is a vexation. Even at night their minds do not rest. This also is vanity. This is the word of the Lord. The second reading is from the third chapter of the book of Colossians. See if you have been raised with Christ. Seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. There are the ways you have also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices, and have clothed yourselves with a new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its Creator. In that renewal there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free. But Christ is all and in all. This is the word of the Lord.
The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 12th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So it will be with those who store up the treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So today I want to start out my sermon with a joke, but before I get started, I want to remind you what I said at the beginning of service and make it perfectly clear that this sermon is not about money. That's not the joke. So here's the joke. What lies at the bottom of the sea and twitches? Thank you. A nervous wreck. I like that. Never said it was going to be a good joke. So, when you are a nervous wreck, what do? When your anxiety runs high, what are some of your tendencies that you have? Better yet, when groups of people or even nations become anxious, how do they tend to behave? Do they open themselves to others? Or do they become closed off and do they kind of circle the wagons? Okay, since you're nodding, you need to respond sometimes, people. Of course, they circle the wagons. They protect themselves and they spend all their focus and their energy on self-preservation or protectionism. And we do the same thing when we're highly anxious. We tend to wall people off and focus our energy on ourselves and on what we think will make us feel less anxious. Or as Luther would call it, we become navel gazers. And imagine the image of that, of people that are looking and curved in on themselves and looking at their belly button. There's a picture, Norman Rockwell picture that my parents always had right by the front door growing up. And it's entitled, "Lift Up Thine Eyes." It's a matter in a city cathedral. I think it's a New York cathedral, New York church. And there's stairs going up to it. And right in the middle, there's the church sign that all churches have. And the person that's working is on a ladder and puts up the sign that says, "Lift up thine eyes." And it's a bigger picture, so you can see the people on the street. And everyone in the street is walking around like this. That's what happens to us when we become anxious. The world disappears and we shrink into ourselves. I found a quote this week that I think speaks volumes to this experience. And it's by the, I think, mystery author, Salmers Roche. I think that's how you say his last name. And he says, "Anxiety is a thin stream of fear trickling through the mind. If encouraged, it cuts a channel into which all other thoughts are drained." I'll read it again. Anxiety is a thin stream of fear trickling through the mind. If encouraged, it cuts a channel into which all other thoughts are drained. I bring all this up because I think ultimately what our lessons today are addressing is anxiety. And you could say the author of Ecclesiastes is a bit anxious. Some might even say depressed after a long life. So too is the brother who came to Jesus with his request, and also the rich farmer in Jesus' story are all anxious. And the thing is, anxiety is not new. And it's still something we experience, regardless of what's going on around on our political stage or world stage. The potential for anxiety has always been with us. And I think regardless of what's going on, our biggest anxiety, one of our biggest sources of anxiety has always been money or resources. It's one of the top 2 reasons why people get divorced. Because we, I think especially us Americans, place a lot of emotional value on stuff. Don't get me wrong, I think some caution is important, but caution is very different from anxiety. And Jesus knew that we had this tendency to place too high an emotional value on resources, because he says in verse 15 of our gospel lesson, one's life does not consist on the abundance of possessions. I wonder how many of us truly believe that statement of Jesus. I don't think the rich farmer in Jesus' story did. Just look at this story from verse 15 to 25, and especially the 3-verse conversation that he has from verse 17 to 19. I mean, really, talk about a curved-in, navel-gazing life. I want you, as I read it, count how many times in those 3 verses he uses the word I or my. So the rich man's land produced an abundance. And you would think that that's a good thing. Normally we would think that when we come into a large sum or a windfall, that is a good thing. But it actually turns out not to be for the farmer. And more often than not, it actually isn't the case when people or organizations come into a lot of money either. Because when that happens, anxiety increases. And so instead of celebrating, this farmer is like, oh no, what am I going to do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he says to himself, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and I will build larger ones. There I will store up my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, I love that part. I mean, really, who speaks to themselves? I will say to Tom, so I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, this is quite a conversation that is this. I mean, the whole story is 5 verses, and 3 of those is a conversation he has with himself. And it actually includes another layer of self-focus. It's a conversation with himself while he's conversating with himself. If you're not keeping track, he said I or my 11 times in those 3 verses. He does say you once. That's actually when he's talking to himself. You almost get the idea that there is no one else in his life except him, or at least no one else that matters. And I think this is why God calls him a fool. First of all, he's a fool because he really had nothing to be anxious about to begin with. Before his crops produced abundance, he was already a rich landowner, and his barns were already full. So he had nothing to be anxious about to begin with. But secondly, he's a fool because though he is rich in resources, he is actually rather bankrupt in life because there is no one else in it. His world has a population of 1. So you see, and this is a hard thing for us Americans to understand, life is not about money or stuff. Money, hear this, money is not a sign of the good life. Possessions are not signs of God's blessing. And stuff is certainly not the answer to anxiety. That is what King Solomon, who is the author of Ecclesiastes, realizes in his old age after spending his entire lifetime amassing it. Because when all is said and done from your hard work, it doesn't achieve what you want it, and it doesn't ultimately protect us. Yes, we need some to survive. But most of us have a hard time understanding the difference between need and want. And regardless, as both Solomon and Jesus point out, and our psalmist pointed out today, no matter how much, no amount of resources will ultimately protect us from what is inevitable: death. It's got a pretty high success rate. The only thing, an overemphasis on what we can do, the only thing that emphasis will do is draw us away from what really matters in life. Love of God and love of neighbor. It can keep us curved in on ourselves. Do you remember, and I thought of this just this morning, do you remember what happened in Lord of the Rings or actually the first book that I don't remember what it is, but when Gollum gets the ring? What happened to him with his over obsession with that ring? Do you remember he got curved in on him? He was in a hunchback. If you saw the movie, he got deformed. He lost all relationships. The only thing that mattered was that ring, and it destroyed his life. This is why Jesus will not arbitrate between the brothers, because it is not about the money. It is not what's ultimately important. And this is why the author of Colossians tells us to put to death the things that are earthly. And when he lists those earthly things, greed is the only thing he associates with idolatry. Because if we focus too heavily on what we can provide and accumulate into our barns and our bank accounts and how much we have, then we place ourselves as provider for all things, and we displace God. And when we take on the responsibility as provider for us, we also take on that anxiety that comes with us. And that is why I wish and I hope you will go home and you will continue to read chapter 12, because it gets really good starting about verse 22 and goes on to 34. Because Jesus will say in verse 22, do not worry. Remember I said weeks and weeks ago that I read somewhere that there do not worry or do not be afraid is in the Bible 365 times. So it's the word that we need to hear every single day of every single year. God provides for the birds of the air and the lilies of the ground, and since we are much more of value, God will also provide for us. God knows how much you need, and God desires to give you what you need. But if we focus too much on what we have or don't have, we will be too anxious to realize what God has already provided. And that is why our Colossians reading reminds us that in the waters of baptism we have died, and our life is in Christ and in God's hands. Therefore, we are encouraged to put away whatever is earthly. And I can't think of anything more earthly or more American than anxiety over stuff. And that is why most major religions encourage, or at least all, encourage tithing. And I'll even say, you don't even have to give your 10% to the church. I might get fired for that, but you don't have to. Just give it away. Even people that I know are not believers, I tell them, give a portion of your money away. Because the more you give it away, the more you realize what you have. And as believers, the more you give it away, you are living into faith that God has given you enough. And you can give away 10% of your income, knowing that there will still be some left to live on, that God has provided enough. Because this sermon and ultimately life is not about money or possessions. The hard truth for today is that we cannot do anything to prolong our life or to eliminate the fickle nature of it. We can't. That builds anxiety for us, but we can't. But what we can do with the life we have is choose how we live it. Because life, or end life, is about loving God and loving our neighbor. It's about reminding ourselves of God's claim on us in baptism, striving to put to death our idolatry, and continually honor God as provider. It's about ending our navel-gazing ways and realizing that the world has a population greater than one. And realizing there are people out there that God has created, that God has cherished, that we are called as believers to love as well as we love ourselves. And ultimately, life is about being a follower of Christ, being a disciple of Jesus, following in his steps, living into this abundant life that Jesus came to give us. And this life is a meaningful life full of faith, full of relationships, and free from anxiety. Because life does not consist on the abundance of possessions. It consists on the abundance of grace God gives us and provides for us every single day. Amen.